Okay, folks, I think we are ready to get started here with our webinar today. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining and spending time with us. I'm Tim Erlin. I'm the VP of Product at Wallarm, and I get the pleasure of hosting this webinar and facilitating the conversation along the way. And today I am joined by two great contributors. First, we have Graham Ludlow, who's the Field CISO at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, or HPE if you prefer. And we also have Ken Foster here, who's the CISO at Candescent. And I'm really glad to have both of them here to talk through this interesting topic with me. So welcome, Graham. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Tim. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Good to be here.
So we're going to talk a little bit about a CISO's guide to API security. So talking about API security with the lens of, really a CISO who's focused on how do I set up an effective program. And in order to cover that topic, there are three, broadly speaking, three items that I want to cover through the webinar, and we'll aim for a bit of a more of a conversation than a presentation. So, definitely want to keep it interactive. A couple of housekeeping items while I'm thinking about it. We are broadcasting this webinar on both Zoom and LinkedIn. So if you have questions while we're talking, feel free to put those questions either into the Q&A on Zoom or into the comments on LinkedIn, and we'll try and pick those up along the way. Because it's being broadcast on LinkedIn, it's also essentially archived there. So if you ever want to see it again, or you want to share it with someone, or you have to leave early, or you showed up late, you can always watch it again on LinkedIn as well. But if you're after the slides, feel free to reach out to us and we can share those too. So with that being said, let's start by talking a little bit about the API threat landscape. And I think rather than diving into the threats themselves, I actually want to start with the not security parts about the API threat landscape because if you've been in security for a while, or even if you're new to security, you understand pretty quickly that the fastest way, the most effective way to secure a system is to simply turn it off. We all have objectives other than security. We all work for some kind of an organization that either has services to deliver or business to run or revenue to generate. And so API security, like any other topic, is ultimately really not about API security. Those aren't the trends that are driving it. So if we could start talking a little bit about what's changing in the technology environment that's making API security a bigger part of the threat landscape or driving API security as a topic, I think that's a good place to start. And I've got a couple of options up here that we see in the market as a whole. I think, Graham, just to start with you, from your perspective, especially as a field CISO, what technology changes or trends are you seeing that are really driving either greater adoption of APIs or a broader deployment of APIs? What shows up for you?
What I'm seeing most is starting with business transformation. Enterprises are trying to be more efficient, more effective, and they're trying to digitally enable the services that they're giving to customers. And I'd say we're almost on the tail end of that trend. That was a big thing for, well, almost a decade. But a lot of companies are laggards, or rather, they're slower to be able to transform. So as we're sort of wrapping up this digital transformation, or maybe just getting into it in the first place, that entails modernizing systems, which typically goes to your first bullet there about API first development. If you're developing a modern platform and you're trying to deliver services that traditionally weren't digital in the digital world or through a multi-channel digital environment, you need to have a lot of APIs, you need to leverage the cloud, and you're going to be talking to a lot of systems and using a lot of third parties.
Mm-hmm.
So the net result of this is you've got APIs all over the place, which is a great thing. It enables the business to deliver new services. It allows for higher efficiency, for better services, but it comes with risk, right? It's an attack surface that's continuing to grow.
Sure.
I will say AI adoption is in there as well. Earlier, of course, we're all going on that journey. It seems like the next phase of digital transformation is something around AI. I'm sure some analyst firm will give it a good name that we can all start using, but let's just call it AI business transformation. That's definitely doing the same thing. We're seeing MCP servers, we're seeing API integrations, we're seeing new ways to access systems and data in a programmatic fashion. And I only see this continuing to accelerate in the future.
There's something you said there at the beginning of your commentary that I wanted to, it wasn't your main point, but I wanted to pull it out because I think it's important, which is that you said we're at the tail end of digital transformation as a sort of as a trend. And I think it's worth pointing out that not every organization is moving at the same pace as every other organization, right? It's a process. There are, for
Right.
any transformation, there are early adopters and there are laggards. And, it may break out by industry, it may just break out by overall risk tolerance of the organization. So if you're a CISO and you're looking at your organization, you have to look at where you are in that transformation as opposed to where the whole market is, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So Ken, what about you in terms of the trends that are driving API adoption as a whole? What do you see as the big influencers here?
Well, I think I tend to agree with Graham there. We're kind of on the tail end of where a lot of companies have been calling themselves API first for a long
Hmm.
time, right?
Hmm.
It's become, especially in the, in the fintech space where I've been for a while, right? We've been using APIs heavily and saying we're API first for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
I do think that your second block there is AI is all about API. So now a lot of that, what you're hearing is that language shift from where API first to where AI first,
Mm.
right? So we're starting to look, how do we take the advantages of AI tied into our APIs and make this even faster and more efficient, which is phenomenal for business delivery and velocity. Is risky because now you've got to make sure you understand all of the risks that come with running an API program and how robust is your API strategy and your API program to start with. Um, and I think that's one thing because it became so easy to develop AIs and people and that term shadow IT as we've used, shadow API,
Sure.
shadow whatever, the unknowns that we know about, right? Or don't know about. So you know, APIs are one of those things because they are fast and easy to build and make connections and move around there. And then it's easy to connect them to an AI solution that's also now crawling and finding all these wonderful APIs that connect to stuff. And it, depending on how you write it, it may become intelligent enough to say, oh, well, here's an API I can use. Let me grab that and connect it here and start moving data. So
Hmm.
now we're increasing the speed at which we lose control and visibility into the AIs that we already didn't have visibility into.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do agree there. It's we've been doing this so much, and then you get into the whole conversation: is an API an actual application, or is it just a mechanism to drive application connectivity? Depends on the mature. Again, you're going back to depends on the maturity of your program and where you're at in that digital transformation that we've all been going through.
I like that you implied that at some point we had control that we could
Yeah,
lose.
yeah,
I mean, to your point, well, so first of all, I put up a couple of statistics from the Postman State of API report. The first of which speaks to exactly your point. 74% of respondents are API first or say they're API first in 2024, up from 66% in 2023. So the majority of the folks who respond to the Postman survey, which, to be fair, has probably a biased selection. The majority say they're API first, for sure. The other interesting thing, Ken, that you touched on there or pointed out is that some of the challenges we have are not new. They just change technology, right? So you had shadow IT, then shadow APIs. Now we're talking about shadow AI. It's the same problem applied to different technologies through that evolution,
yeah.
which makes sense. But
Yeah,
I
and I
do
mean,
want to, yeah, go ahead, Ken.
I was going to say the other statistic out there, right, is I think one I've seen recently is 50% of most of the recent attacks that are public attacks have happened through an API,
Hmm.
right? And so there's, we're seeing not only seeing an increase that we're API first, the threat actors are also using those same things and they're
Sure.
encouraging. It's like we love you to be API first and not have a good program around it. It makes our job easier.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And we
yeah,
well, we've got a couple of examples in a slide to talk through of
yeah.
that. Um, That's interesting. I mean, if we just to finish off the topic around sort of what are the trends pushing us, you also
Mhm.
mentioned business velocity, and I think it's important, especially as CISOs, to understand how API development and API first development is connected to increased business velocity. So, Graham, from your perspective, what do you see from organizations in terms of the business drivers for focusing more on APIs?
Yeah. Well, that one once per day batch file transfer to get inventory from one system to another just doesn't cut it anymore, right? You need to be real time. And I think this ties in with a question that I saw pop up tangentially, but also a point, Ken, after what you said that resonated with me. It's not just software development companies that this is a problem for. This is a problem for everyone. Because as you're doing business and you have business partners, third
Mm.
parties are using now APIs to transfer data back and forth to you, which is great because it's not coming in by email anymore or FTP, but it's also a risk because if you're not a software forward company, you might not have the inherent knowledge and skill set that a company that does a lot of software development has. And that can make it more of a challenge to understand the nature of the threat and the vulnerability and how to deal with it.
Yeah, yeah. For the everyone in the audience, you just have to pardon my cheesy animation in this slide. I couldn't resist because I do feel like, given all that business pressure on APIs, that for cybersecurity, it's a bit like the Titanic heading towards this iceberg. And I love the iceberg metaphor, Graham, and it plays into what you were just saying. That there are you think that you maybe don't have to worry about APIs because you're not a software development company. I will argue that most companies somewhere along the way are software development companies at this point. Someone is building software somewhere. It's rare that that's not the case, but there are different types of APIs to talk about. You brought up partner APIs as one example. Obviously, public APIs, if you're building those and deploying them for someone to use as a service, and private APIs that are used internally. If you're a large enough company, your internal footprint is big enough that you may have, significant insider threat as well. And then, Ken, you mentioned AI. We'll talk about AI more than once in this webinar, I have no doubt. But those AI APIs are another piece of that iceberg that we just have to deal with as CISO. So if we shift that perspective from how APIs are connected to the business, we can now talk about what are those threats. What are the concerns that CISOs should have when we look at the API landscape that's out there? So, Ken, from your perspective, what comes to mind? What's top of mind for you in terms of that API threat that the CISOs need to worry about?
Yeah, so I think outside of um, the non-human identity aspect of it, the lack of inventory, the shadow APIs as we're talking about. I think
Hmm.
I see a tangent, I see a question over here and about third-party risk, right? It is so much now about how integrated we are with other third parties or that they have APIs connecting to us and how important it is to understand that business flow. And I think that you hit on a great point, Tim, is talking about as a CISO now, if you do not understand how the business is interacting with all of their customers, their vendors, all the third parties connected to us, how that interaction is happening, what is supposed to be moving back and forth between, how are we securing that? How do I keep those from being very easily, something as simple as rate limiting, right, on an API. How do I make sure that my own API connection to another customer, which may not be malicious, but may cause a business resiliency issue because I'm my third parties, or I'm taking down a person or they're taking me
Yeah,
down because we haven't done the right rate limiting on there, and it's that's some of the big stuff that I've got that I'm worried about right now. And again, the non-human identity piece of this, and I'll tie AI into that too, because I think they
sure.
go hand in hand, right? They technically are an employee of some kind, right? If you want to, you need to actually treat them, secure them like it is an employee's ID, right? You
Yeah,
can't, you can't just build something that's going to go out and do this process and not have some kind of controlling mechanism to govern it and watch what it's doing. And I think that's a carryover from APIs because we have built these APIs to do a process for us that may have been replacing a manual batch, somebody clicking a button and kicking off a batch process. It's now an automated near real time
hmm,
process. You can do a lot of damage very quickly with these near real time or real time APIs now. So that really, the lack of visibility and monitoring of that
Mm.
can, and not only just because of security issues, but I'm also thinking about it from an operational standpoint because you can do a lot of damage with just badly written, poorly controlled APIs that are actually causing reputational issues and customer sat issues just because you have a poor performing API out there.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up rate limiting because if you're going to implement rate limiting on an API, you actually have to understand what the business purpose of that API is, what the rate should be, what's acceptable. So it's not just a flaw in code, it's actually about understanding the business logic, so that you can apply an appropriate rate limit. And that includes understanding if there are, weekly, quarterly, seasonal changes in those rates. Because if you put in the wrong rate limit, then as you say, Ken, a poorly deployed and implemented API can have reputational or service,
Hmm.
service impacts.
Thinking about that too, that could be now if you know what the rate's supposed to be and you understand those seasonal bursts and you look at all this, when that happens out of the norm, you now have an indicator of a possible security issue, possible
Yeah.
attack. So you do have to understand that entire workflow so you can put the appropriate controls around that API program to say, hey, this is not normal. This isn't end of month. This isn't Black Friday. We're not expecting
Yeah.
this big spike right now. Why did we get a spike all of a sudden? Do
Yeah.
we have something else going on?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It really does require knowledge about the business and how it runs,
Yeah.
in order to understand. Absolutely. So, Graham, just to go back to the original question there, from your perspective, what are the threats that CISOs need to worry about, for APIs? What's top of mind for you?
Yeah. I would put the API threats into two broad categories. I think you have malicious bad actors who are going to
Hmm.
try to attack you, and you need to defend your APIs. You need to defend that. And I started my career, security was really about stopping data leakage and stopping hackers from stealing data, if I were to simplify it. And then ransomware came around. And now it became they're going to shut down your business operations and they don't really care about data. So we had to pivot to be resilient. Well, now it's come full circle again. And now those same hackers, yeah, they'll shut you down, but they'll also steal your data because now they can hold that and extort you with it. So it's really
Hmm.
just an advanced extortion attack. So, from that lens, you need to defend your APIs, not just against data leakage, but also from disruption. And Ken, it goes right along with what you were saying. If you can get DDoS through an API, if they can take out a service, if they can order a million pizzas, if they can, do something with through either business logic or just sheer volume that can disrupt you, it's going to be used as a weapon against you. The
Yeah.
second broad thing, talk to your data privacy folk. We live in a regulated environment now where you need to know where every iota of personal information is coming from and going to. If you have an API that was well intended to share data with, say, a third party, going back to a third party risk, and it is accidentally leaking PII, there can be no breach per se, no bad actor, no one trying to do anything wrong. But now you've run afoul maybe of the agreement with your customers of how you're collecting and using their data, maybe with a regulator who you've attested
Hmm.
we're not storing data in country A, B, or C. So that's a whole nother threat that you need to take into account when you're thinking about APIs and how easy, so to speak, it is to exchange data with third parties now.
You've touched on two of my favorite topics. One is, we talk a lot about DDoS, distributed denial, and so much so that we forget what the acronym means, right? Distributed
Fair
denial of
point. Fair
service.
point. Yeah.
But with the growth in APIs, we're seeing a resurgence of what I would call more traditional DOS or denial of service, targeted at a specific API, not distributed. It's not these massive volumetric floods, but specifically that service or that API, which is interesting to consider and concerning. The
Mhm.
other
Yeah.
is the sensitive data topic. If you're, and this goes to development, right? If you're a developer and someone says, "Hey, I need an API with access to these three pieces of data," and the database, table contains eight pieces of data, it's very tempting for that developer to write the API so it just serves up all eight. Maybe don't tell anybody. Maybe do. They're going to ask me for it anyway at some point. And so we absolutely see APIs that provide data they shouldn't, or that wasn't part of the original spec. And that's a kind of disclosure that's a problem, right? As you said, it can run afoul of sort of regulatory requirements for sure. Definitely, definitely. So let's take a look at some real incidents, because I always like to pair sort of the data side of the conversation with things that happen in the real world. Because while some of us respond well to data, others respond well to stories. So we've got a few stories we can tell here. Um, I think I picked three incidents that were recent, July and September, so very recent, really. And they all sort of represent a different approach or a different problem in terms of API related incidents. We can start with this Paradox AI one. Notably, it's AI related. I will also point out that it's an issue that was Paradox, but it was also McDonald's. So there's a big brand here, and there's a supply chain aspect to it with a piece of software that they were using. And essentially, there's an API related exploit that allows, through manipulation of this chatbot, exposed candidate data, hiring, employees hiring candidates via some API misconfigurations related to McDonald's. So, I mean, Ken or Graham, either of you, any particular aspects of that incident that jumped out at you as lessons that CISOs should take away, or things that does it illustrate things that they should be concerned about in particular?
I think it brings up a great point, right? As this gets into kind of where we're headed, right? Is
Mhm.
with using an AI agent to call APIs to accomplish a process that may have had two or three humans in the pipeline eventually, and they, you know, understanding how to defeat it. And this reminds me of another one I heard. It wasn't McDonald's, but basically by prompting correctly, getting it
Hmm.
to pull an API and return data it shouldn't return, right? Uh, so I think that's one thing. Again, if this goes back to we probably rely on traditional tools that we think have been protecting AI or APIs to this point, and not fully understanding the business logic and just having some these legacy controls that we've had in place, kind of generic security controls to protect this, and not understanding the business logic behind how could it be exploited. So I think we have an over reliance of we've done it this way for a long time and we thought this was good enough, but the landscape is changing rapidly, right?
Yeah.
And not understanding that business logic in there and being able to build specific controls and specific gateways or checkpoints in there to stop that from right there, right? If I have a misconfigured API, I'm using a chat bot that reaches out and says, "Hey, show me all the hiring data or demographic data on the way I'm hiring people." It should never have that ability to access that from an external AI chatbot, right? But there's a flaw in the business logic and a control was not there to keep it from connecting and pulling that data back. So I think that's
Yeah.
one thing we have to do. And it goes back to some of the basics too. It's just access controls and inventory of this and then understanding business logic. I think that's the stuff that we've really got to be looking out for.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting how you can almost go back to the classic principle of least privilege,
Yeah.
and look at how do you apply that to AI agents who have access to these APIs. Make sure that they don't have access to data they're not supposed to.
Yeah, and I mean,
Um,
unfortunately, a lot of times when we start talking about these modern attacks and modern, if you ultimately get to the root of it and start looking at it, it's like it's the same thing we should have been doing all along. Limiting
yes.
access, role-based, encrypting
Yeah.
data, limiting what data is
It,
exposed, and it just amazes me that we go back to these basic hygiene issues
Yeah.
that we've been talking about in cyber, for 30 plus years.
yeah,
So,
it's
yeah,
true. It's true. Although
Yeah.
it does, the non-human identity angle does it changes the problem a little bit, I think, because now you've got, for example, an agent. It should have access to, for example, in this chatbot, it should have access to every candidate. It might need that access for some of its operations, but you've moved from an authentication problem to an authorization problem, right?
right.
So it's how do you authorize the individual API calls to the scope of the prompt that generated them. And I don't, as far as I can tell, I don't think that's a problem that's been solved.
Not
Um,
that I'm aware of.
yeah,
No, I mean
No.
it's yeah.
yeah, yeah, challenging. So not to, I guess I could say it was a rough couple of months for, fast food and API breaches because Restaurant Brands International is the parent company that owns Burger King, Popeyes, Tim Hortons, and Firehouse Subs. And their incident was with their drive-through ordering system, basically. And there were multiple issues here that a couple of researchers found that included things like you know, unauthenticated open APIs, lack of validation for people signing up, whether they were employers or not, sensitive data that was exposed. They ultimately ended up finding recordings of people at the drive-through that they could listen to. which interesting, but not related to the actual exploit. Those recordings were being fed to AI for analysis, which is
Mhm.
an interesting business piece of it. But definitely an illustration of some of the business logic issues that are becoming prevalent with APIs as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then last but not least, this FlexPay one, the FlexPay is a payment processor in India. The reason this incident was interesting to me is because it's a good reminder that sometimes the attackers aren't after data, they're after money.
Mm.
Because there was a direct financial implication here of these unauthorized payouts of $170,000 more or less. It's not about the data there. It's just about the money.
No. Yeah, I want to jump in about the RBI
Yeah,
one
please.
because I think that's a great example. And I think we all understand and respect that each of these companies has security programs and they're
Absolutely.
doing their absolute best here. And I would never take one example out of context. I'm just saying it out loud for everyone watching. And because what both I think McDonald's was doing, what RBI was doing was digital transformation, right? They're bringing new services and trying to leverage modern technology.
Yeah.
And I would guess, just based on my personal experience, the security teams have all the legacy stuff they have to deal with and all of this new stuff they have to deal with too. And aligning with the business needs to help with recruiting new candidates, which is probably a big problem for McDonald's, right? Maintaining this
Yeah.
huge workforce, and for RBI for making that drive-through experience better. I love some of the new technologies in drive-through that you can do. You can order online and go and pick up. It's wonderful as a consumer, but it's risk, right? These are new technologies, just like what we started with. So they're both prime examples here about getting back to basics, but also I would advise everyone, if your business is doing something like this, the bad guys are also seeing what all this is happening. I think in one of these stories, the researchers specifically targeted them because they thought it was dystopian what they were doing with AI. I think that was a quote in one of the articles about the Paradox AI breach. So you
Mm.
got to think your threat actors, they have limited time and attention as well. So they're going to go after the new stuff. They're going to go after the new promoted stuff. So as a security team, if you're aligned with that thinking and aligned with your business, it can help you get the funds and the resources in order to do API security and other security for these new systems that are being built.
Yeah. And I want to thank you for that reminder, because of course the purpose of looking at incidents is not to cast judgment on these
Oh,
organizations, but
never.
to figure out
Yeah,
what we can learn from them so that we can apply those learnings to our own organizations. That's ultimately
absolutely.
the goal, for sure. Thank you, Graham. Okay, so let's move on from oh, sorry, there is one more slide. Of course, we don't plan exactly how the conversation is going to go ahead of time. So I did put in a slide about how AI and APIs are connected because I wanted to make sure we covered it. I think, Ken, you brought this up earlier, that there is a clear connection between the growth in use and deployment of AI and the number of APIs that are being deployed as well. So I don't know, Ken, do you want to just sort of, reiterate that point, sort of put a clear summary there of what that
Yeah,
connection is?
I mean, you think about it as we try, and I think this goes back to the velocity thing, right?
Hmm.
So we've developed APIs to be able to move and connect and process faster. So now we're using AI agents and to allow that to happen even faster or semi-autonomous, right? Allow it to ask the question, it to go figure out the best way to return data and move at a pace that is faster than we can do with people inside of it, which is great. It's ultimately going to be a really good thing, I think, for a lot of businesses to be able to move and make changes at the speed of the customer request, I guess is the best way to put it, right? Uh, but when these AI agents are allowed to maybe have a little more free reign of the environment on where they can learn and build their knowledge base from, they start seeing maybe patterns that we haven't seen or thought about from a traditional cybersecurity or even risk or business logic. And it may decide that this is the best way for it to do a thing. And ultimately, not maliciously, but ultimately return data or return back information it shouldn't return back because
Hmm.
it like you said, having those individual APIs written for each individual step of a prompt to go, well, you can have access to name and phone number, or a person's name and maybe their email, but you can't have their address with that, right? But at a certain point, depending on who the user is using the AI or interrogating or prompting the AI, they may need to have access to all that. So it's highlighting the fact that you have to have a really robust authorization and access control program. So
Yeah.
entitlement, that authorization, you've got to have good data quality, you got to have good data governance, and you got to have this good authorization and access control around it. Because if you don't, it's going to access data not because it was doing something maliciously, it's just because it was there and it went, well, I'm gonna go see what this teaches me, and I'm gonna learn, and I'm gonna add it to my knowledge base and move faster than most of us can keep up with on the security side. And I think Graham brought up a great point too, and you brought it up as well, Tim, is look, we as the internal security department, right? We have to look at emerging technologies and the transformation we're going through. We also got to keep the lights on and protect what's already in place. And rarely are we budgeted and resourced to be able to do both.
Yeah.
Whereas the malicious actors see the same thing. They're looking at the cutting edge emerging technology. They see they're able to jump on the opportunity faster than we're able to catch up to them to jump on the opportunity. And that is where we fall behind, right? Is because they're able to dump whatever they were doing before, move to the latest emerging technology and be ahead of us, where we still have to keep, we may have a bunch
Yeah.
of APIs out there, but somewhere we still got a batch processing thing that we also have to keep up
That's
and
right.
running because
Yep.
somebody's
Yeah.
still using
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So,
We love talking about how technology evolves, but the reality
yeah,
is that for most organizations, it doesn't evolve, it aggregates, right?
Mhm.
And you're right, the
right,
attacker doesn't have to deal with that aggregation. They just
right,
deprecate what they don't want to use and move on to the new
right.
cool tech. Yeah.
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 I love this visualization because it expresses something that just sort of crystallized in my mind when I saw it. Long time ago, we used to do API security manually because there weren't a lot of them. We had some really smart people who understood APIs. We'd do a little pen testing, we'd look at how they were derived and we would move on. And that's, 2016, it was doable.
Hmm.
But I agree with this fundamentally. This problem is getting exponentially bigger. And at some point, every organization is going to realize I can't just do this manually anymore because that person is going to be so overwhelmed. They can't keep up. So that almost demands some sort of automated solution to deal with the velocity and the complexity that the problem is bringing to the security team.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think you're absolutely right. Yeah, go ahead, Ken. You were going to say
I was
something.
going to say, and to add on to that, I mean, understanding the complexity, because these APIs, you're right, early on they were fairly simplistic. They connected to a couple of things. They did a couple of there's so many layers now to an API that what it can and can't do. They're so complex at this point in time. It is very difficult. Well, it's not difficult. It's impossible for one tool or one person to know everything that API is going to do by having to manually review it. You've
Hmm.
got to be able to work at it faster. And I mean, that's where we see these AI specific payloads that are being put out there and injected into it because it's overwhelming the current tool sets that we've been using because they're not complex enough to look at the layers of depth inside of an API, and they're able to find that flaw 3 million lines of code in and go, oh, I can do this and be able to accomplish my goal. And
Yeah.
I think that's the one thing we've really got to be paying attention to is having the tooling that helps us understand the complexity of this.
Yeah, and I think Ken, you're bridging into the next topic that I wanted to touch on is this idea of how do you how do you think about as a CISO, how do you think about maturity around API security, right? Because we said early on that not every organization is at the same stage in terms of their transformation, their use of APIs, or even just their maturity of their security organization. So when we look at what different organizations should be working on at different stages, um, what's important? First of all, how do you assess where you are? Like, how do you assess as a CISO where your organization is in terms of maturity? What are the questions that you should be asking? Maybe that's a good place to start.
Well,
Yeah, so
oh,
go
go ahead.
ahead, Greg. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I always start with policy. I mean, if I were outgunned as a CISO and I had to get something done, I would start with policy, training, and education. Because I think that's the first step. You got to make sure your developers, but also your IT staff and even your employees understand that APIs are a thing, they exist, they're sharing data so that when they encounter them, whether it's deploying a new tool in an infrastructure team or developing an app, they know the difference between right and wrong, right? That's the best place to start because you can head off a lot of problems by having a better informed and more security aware workforce. So that's always where I would start.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you have the policy, once people know what the policy is, you go to different maturity of enforcing that policy. It can start with manual, and then it can get into more of an automated state and hopefully even like a protective state. So I kind of like this maturity model as it's being displayed because I think the ultimate goal is that you have an automated, optimized process to go with the CMM cliche model.
Mm-hmm.
It can automatically discover, but also protect those APIs because the best process in the world and the most well-informed people are still going to make mistakes. So you need to have a way to proactively head off problems to account for just human error.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and
Ken, anything you
I
wanted to
think
say there? Yeah.
I was going to say, I think to build off of that, right? You've got to have an inventory and a catalog. You got to understand where APIs are being used. So that means you've got to be building. If you're in the middle between the developer driven and the security driven, what you've got to do is bridge that gap right there and start becoming the partner with your development team and understanding what those business use cases is, what they're developing these APIs to do, so you can start making sure you've got a good inventory, a good catalog. You can then take that policy and apply governance to it so you can figure out how you're going to measure them and help them understand where their risks are. Um, and then make sure you've got somebody who make sure they understand that they should be following a framework and a guideline for building APIs, right?
Mm.
OWASP is now, OWASP, what was it? I think it's been within the last 5 years, came out with API specific top 10, right?
2020, well, 2019 and then 2023, they
Yeah,
updated it. Yeah.
yeah, they updated it. So I mean, it took till 2019 for them to come out with it, but they updated it fairly quickly compared to some of the other OWASP that they've updated, right? Because it is this ever-changing environment. And you got to rely on not just gateways and WAFs, but you've also got to have runtime protection now so you can actually see what's going on. And then like we were talking about, access and authorization. One of the big keys here is understanding your access and authorization on how and what they're connecting to and what they have access to.
Yeah.
Because without that, you're you're well behind the eight ball as trying to help them reduce risk.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think I'm going to pick out a couple of things there. Like there's sort of two bookends, if you will, of the preventative controls of access and authorization. So, you want to start by making sure that people and the not people, the non-human identities are authenticating and they're authorizing for what they're supposed to be doing. And then the other bookend of that is the runtime protection, right? Making
Right.
sure that you can block attacks, that you can detect anomalies and stop them, because it's a complex problem and you're probably not going to get perfect authorization and authentication. So
Right.
you're going to end up with things that you need to, sort of protect from as well.
And I think life cycle management is and hygiene are overlooked in all of this as well, because
Hmm.
making sure you've got good version control, life cycle management, and good hygiene on deprecating and blocking off access to those old APIs that are no longer being used, I think is one of the very important pieces
Yeah.
of that that's often overlooked.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think the conversation is sort of bleeding into the last section now. So I'll advance the slides to keep up with how we're talking about it, because I wanted to end the webinar with a discussion around API security program requirements, and ideally to give CISOs and security leaders who are listening a little bit of I'll call it a framework, but it's probably not a full framework, but at least a framing with which to think about those requirements, right? Something that you could actually remember. Unlike some of the NIST documents, which are pages and pages. Four things, right? If you're thinking about API security, you've got to discover, you've got to protect, you've got to respond, you've got to test. So let's talk about some of the requirements for each of these. We could start with discovery. The old adage, you can't protect what you don't know about. We've touched on this a little bit, but Graham, from your perspective, when you think about discovery, API discovery specifically, What are the key requirements that a CISO needs to keep in mind for that part of the program?
Yeah, I'd say that it needs to be able to discover APIs that are used both within your environment and the ones that you're connecting to. You can't just
Mm,
think about the one that you control and own, because if you're using another API, that could lead to some exposure for you.
hmm
So
hmm
I'd say that's number one that you need to look at. I would say not necessarily the number one, but one of the unique things that you should take into
Yeah.
consideration as you're scoping an assessment. Um,
What about one of the things that you remind me of there is that because we were just looking at that maturity model with
yep,
developer driven and security driven. I think that we often, when we talk about API security, we often find ourselves thinking about the APIs that we build and deploy ourselves. It's an AppSec problem. But increasingly, there are commercial off-the-shelf products that we buy that open up APIs, that come with APIs or offer APIs. Those have got to fit into the discovery process somewhere as well, right?
100%. Absolutely. And that's what I mean. Like, you can't just limit it to the ones that you own and that you're developing. You need to consider
Hmm.
all of those use cases. Otherwise, you have an incomplete inventory and you've got a gap and a blind spot. You'd never want
Sure.
that as a CISO, right? Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, automation, of course, is very important. It should be real time. And this might go into the later phases, but classification and understanding and context. These are important too. It's great to have an inventory. Here's a bunch of API endpoints. Okay, well,
Yeah.
which ones are a problem? Which
Yeah.
ones are
Yeah.
I need to dive into? Because even with an automated tool, you can't necessarily tackle everything. So they'd be able to classify that quickly, even if it's just guideposts of terms of, well, you should look at this or need to do a deeper dive here is phenomenally important.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an important point. I mean, while I called the section discover, I think I've used the term and I've seen the term API security posture management. So posture management could fit here as well if you want to think about it that way. It's not just the inventory, but it's also the context
Yeah.
that matters too. Yeah. Yeah. Ken, anything in this space that jumps out at you is particularly important?
Uh, I mean, I think you guys have covered a lot of it, but and I think a strong third party risk management questionnaire around the
Mm,
APIs and how they're designed and how they're connecting. And part of that, like we talked about earlier, should be talking about the business logic piece of this as well.
yeah.
Understanding if we're connecting to a partner through an API, what are those rates we're expecting? When are those burst times we're expecting? Help us dial in our monitoring a little bit better and our tools to understand that those third party connections so we know when something is out of the norm, that is not a business problem. It's an
Hmm.
actual indicator of something else. So I
Yeah.
think that's a big piece of it. And um, I think a good again, I'm going to go back to something else that I think this covers both APIs and AI is a good data governance program, right? Understanding what those APIs are connecting to and what type of data they have access to.
Yeah.
It's a problem for both AI and API in today's world. If you don't understand what data lives where and that you're
Sure.
accidentally exposing sensitive data, you're going to do it with any
Uh,
tool out there. But having that as a part
yeah.
of your thought process around your API discovery is going to be a big piece of it.
Yeah, I mean, for APIs alone, it's a complex problem, but it's
Yeah,
deterministic.
yeah,
For AI, it's both non-deterministic and complex, which makes it an
right,
even harder problem to solve.
Right.
Agreed.
right.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I put a couple other requirements up there, that I think were relevant. We don't need to talk about all of them. I think some of them are fairly obvious. But good to cover some of the highlights. So if we move from discover to protection, let's talk about actually doing something about attacks, actually protecting those APIs. I'll start with you this time, Ken. What jumps out at you as sort of important in that protection arena, if you will?
So I think when we look at like the business logic abuse, right? I think that's one it's fairly I think it's overlooked today a lot of times. We
Hmm.
look at the more traditional blocking and API protocols and the
Yeah, SQL injection, that kind of
SQL
thing.
injection, that stuff, we focus on that because it's well-known attacks and stuff like that. I think looking at the behavior-based and the business logic abuse are two areas you need to focus on. You need
Yeah,
to
yeah,
because if you're testing your APIs and doing fuzzing and stuff like that, you also should be doing it against the business logic, right? It shouldn't just be the protocols and things like that. Um, So I think those are two of the areas that you really need to understand and focus on, because I think the rest of them are more well known, and there's a lot of tools out there that are going to help you. Whereas I think the behavior based and the business
Hmm.
logic are a little more nuanced and make
Yeah.
you a lot. You need to have a very good understanding of what you're doing to generate revenue using these APIs or how they're being used in your environment, so you can put a good program around that.
Yeah, yeah. I've been trying to come up with a good definition, for business logic abuse, and the best I've come up with so far is, which I will admit I might be stealing from somewhere and I don't remember, but using the API as it was designed, not as it was intended.
Right.
Um,
Mm,
right. Because it's working the way it was designed. It's just not how people intended it to be used. So,
right.
Graham, what about you? What jumps out at you on the protection side of things?
Yeah. I think protection side, of course, said earlier, that's really where you want to get to. You want to be proactive. You want to have an active defense. I think this, like, remember when we had networks before we had firewalls?
Hmm.
It was a thing, and it's
Yes.
incredible to believe. And this is the same thing, right? This is about having something that's exposed often to the internet. You need to have a layer of protection in front of it.
Yeah.
So,
That pesky perimeter, it keeps moving, right?
yeah, exactly, exactly. And those bad guys, I mean, they're smart, right? If they know you've got, and everyone who knows me, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool zero trust guy. I love zero trust. I think it's phenomenal. I think it's the right approach to security. And even if you're, say, zero trust on your network, are you zero trust on your APIs, right? If you're zero trust on your endpoints, are you zero trust on your apps? So moving that protective perimeter virtually in front of your APIs is absolutely critical. I mean, if you're not
Yeah.
doing that, um, it's like putting a computer on the internet with no firewall. Are you just
Yeah.
trusting that you're patched and up to date? Try that
Yeah.
as an
Yeah.
experiment. I've done it before. It's shocking
Uh,
how quickly computers are compromised.
I'll throw in some data from late last year. Wallarm did an API honeypot experiment. We
Ah,
set up a multi-location honeypot. There's a whole report on it, but the time to discovery for those APIs, the average was 29 seconds. So you put up an API, open on the internet, takes less than a minute for it to see some traffic, just pure time to discovery. So, you know, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, oh, I skipped one. So response, right? We can't uh, stop every single attack, maybe, even the attacks that we stop, maybe we need to respond to them in some way. What are the key components when you're a CISO thinking about how you want to prepare your organization for responding to API incidents? What are the key requirements that come to mind? Graham, you want to start with this one?
yeah, and I've got a story to tell too. I won't say who it was with because I don't want to point any fingers myself, but I was part of an attack that was not necessarily complex. It was a sort of a business logic attack on an API to trigger the phone verification process. And it probably was more of a test or a proof of concept because it wasn't a huge DOS attack and it wasn't really
Hmm.
causing a ton of harm, but it was super annoying. And we lacked an API security specific solution. And even just getting a list of the IP addresses that were connecting to the API in order to affect this small attack, it was so hard. I mean,
Yeah.
we were going to the network team, we were going to our ISP and network service providers, and it was just something you think would be really easy. That real time visibility, who's coming in and what IPs. So if we could just block them, we would have been fine. For some firewall rules, we would have been fine. But it was just a major challenge. To be fair, they were bouncing around a lot and changing rapidly.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I'd say real-time visibility into the activity going to your APIs, you're going to get so much more context and so much more API security focused information to be able to respond to attacks that you're not going to get anywhere else in your security stack. So I'd go
Sure.
with that
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. 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 I think that's an interesting story. Ken, anything that jumps out at you here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is both of all of what Graham talked about is important, but I think too, you got to make sure that you cover API specific attacks inside your
Hmm.
incident response plan,
Hmm.
right? So if your incident response plan is not taking into account this is an API driven attack and it hasn't been practiced, and your guys don't understand, your team doesn't understand how to get the right logging out of the APIs, how to
Yeah.
look at what it has access to, the context around it, what the payloads it should be moving and shouldn't be moving, right? And being able to look at it at that level. I think that's a big piece that I think of. And in the last few years, I think that's one of the things I've seen
Uh,
in a few incident response plans that are definitely missing. So as you're trying to respond to this stuff, you need to be also be practicing for these API attacks, not just your traditional attacks. So
I think that's a critically important point, actually. Even though I work for a vendor and we sell a tool, I think most of the problems that we see are ultimately people process training problems. You can have a great tool in place, but if your team doesn't know how to use it or when to use it,
Hmm.
it's not going to do you any good. It's not going to be effective. It's
you
critical.
also got to have an escalation path in there going, when are you authorized to shut it off?
Hmm.
Right? So if it's a revenue generating
Yeah.
API and customers are connected to it,
Yeah.
when am I allowed to shut it off?
And
Yeah.
Right?
that's the importance of making those decisions before they need to be made, so there
Yeah,
isn't hesitation.
right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, absolutely. All right, the last category we had here is testing, and I always say testing could be last or it could be first because really it's a circle, right? You want to remove risk before it goes into production, but DevOps is a circle or DevSecOps is an infinity symbol. So when we talk about testing APIs, what's the critical requirement? What jumps out, Ken? What jumps out for you around testing?
uh, like I said, I think earlier on we were kind of talking about a little bit in there is making sure not only are you testing your typical DAST and SAS tools, but you've got that runtime testing in there, but you're looking at the business logic, right? And making sure you're testing that as well. I think CI/CD integration jumps out there at me right now and then that CI/CD integration needs to be in the lower environments, and you need to be testing it to the same
Hmm.
standard that your production environment is going to be at, so you don't go from a lower controlled environment to a higher controlled environment, that you break something and then they want to roll a piece out that is critical to stopping that. It's a war story from too many times in the past is that, yeah, it worked great in production or it worked great in dev. We put it in production, it broke something. So we took that out and we're going to look at it and we're going to get around to fixing it. Well, it never gets fixed. And
Hmm.
now you're exposed. So I think when you're doing that testing, it's got to be real world production level testing in an environment that has the same controls. So you can validate, hey, if it breaks it, great. We can agree that we're going to figure out a different mitigation strategy or a different way to address that problem, but we need to know about it before it goes into production. Because
Yeah.
my biggest concern is always you roll something back because it caused that breakage and it never gets re-implemented. So you're living with an exposure.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. So I know we're getting close to the end of our time here. I know we've got a bunch of questions, so I want to give us a chance to answer some of those questions. If you have a question you haven't asked it yet, feel free to put it in there, and I'll pull them up and see what we can do here. So the first question I want to answer or ask at least. Um, oh, there are a bunch of questions in here about AI actually. So how do you protect agentic AI from threat actors who see it as the main target to breach, um, into the core database, it says here, but into the data, the crown jewels, if you will. I mean, that's a big question, right? I think that's a question that the industry as a whole is trying to answer right now. Graham,
Yeah, I think that
yeah.
I was gonna say that's almost its own webinar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'll give my 10-second answer. So at least maybe I think you need to think about the agentic AI system in terms of the front end of how are you interfacing with it, and then the back end, how is it interfacing with your other systems. So within context of APIs, that's what we already talked about, governing,
Yeah.
what does it have access to? AI agents can't really reason, right? They might have a framework they follow, but just like generative models, they don't reason and think like a human does. They recreate patterns based on weights in a neural network. So you need to be very careful about data in, data out. Yeah, that's making sure those are balanced and
Yeah.
make sure that you're limiting access appropriately to minimize impact.
Yeah. I think partly you're pointing out there is look at the control surfaces that you have access to, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah,
agents that you interact with them over APIs, they connect other things over APIs. That's a control surface that you have access to where you
exactly.
could apply
That's a place you
controls.
can inject security. Yep.
Yep.
Okay, cool. How about this one? In a highly complex environment, how do you recommend APIs used across a range of systems are identify in order for security configs, et cetera, are understood and documented? It was a good question, but I think it kind of trailed off there in terms of my understanding of what they're asking. How do you recommend APIs used across a range of systems are identified
Hmm.
in order for security configs to be understood and documented, maybe? I
Yeah,
think the
I
question
think
there
this goes back.
is about inventory and
It's
context.
about inventory and discovery, right?
Yeah, yeah,
You've got to be able to understand the inventory and discovery system of that, but you also got to understand data flow. You've got to understand the data flows across these systems and what's where's the API basically. I mean, to kind of oversimplify probably what they're asking is how's it moving data from point A to point B to point C to point D, right? How are all those
mm,
interconnects happening and understanding what is supposed to happen at each step of that and what the business logic is around each of that step so I can put the right control in place at those points to make sure it doesn't deviate from that.
yeah, yeah,
It's not an easy thing to do, right? Because more than likely, if you're just now coming back and doing this, you're gonna have to do a lot of discovery, and you're probably gonna have to sit down and do a lot of discussion with your development and business teams and understand what they're accomplishing. If you don't already have a
yeah.
discovery tool in place.
Yeah. Well, and similar to what we said before, these are old problems applied to new technology. There's nothing wrong with going back to your asset inventory system and saying, how do I do this with asset inventory? What lessons can I take from there and apply to APIs? Because
Yeah.
there may be a different kind of asset, but I still need the same
Well, and that's a great
context.
point, Tim. They're an asset,
Yeah.
right? Either you call them an asset or you call them an entity, which we've had that
Mhm.
discussion before too, right? It's still because they have their own identity, they have their own access and authorization. So in a certain way, they're an entity that is an asset. And I need to think about them on how would I keep Graham from moving data between multiple things if he's doing it manually? I want to think the same
Etc.
way. Yeah, right, right.
Right.
But you got to think the same way around an API. You kind of have to treat it as it, like I said early on, you kind of have to treat it as an employee.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. Well, listen, we're at the end of our time here, and I want to just thank you both, Graham and Ken, for the participation. I thought it was a really great webinar, super interesting, lots of good conversation. Hopefully, everyone who attended thought the same thing. Thank you for attending, spending time with us, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.